All right, today I have the great opportunity to chat to a guy I've gotten to know. Well, I got to know him probably a decade ago, and we've always stayed in touch. We always have a great time ribbing each other, just talking to each other every time we meet. I caught up with him just before NAMM to get scheduled for a podcast interview. Talked to him, verified at NAMM, and now here he is. So I'm really excited to introduce you to Huston Singletary. Hey, man, how's it going?
It's going good. How are you?
All right. Hey, thanks for taking time out of your schedule to have a chat. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Why don't we kick this off by having you describe what you're doing right now?
Okay. So basically, 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, really 7 days a week. I'm working for a company by the name of Ableton, and most folks probably listening to this podcast are familiar with Ableton and the products live and push. And I've been with this company full time for just over 10 years. So I think we're in 11th year now. And my role has changed over the years. When you and I met, I was sort of in the position of clinician, presenter,
Right.
demo guy, and that would be both on the retail front, at the educational level, store level, and of course trade shows. And that's kind of where we met, along with the cycling crew back in the day. And since then, over that 10-year span, obviously the company's grown and the products have evolved, but my role has changed many times from a clinician to the demo guy to a brand manager, working in retail, working in education, even marketing to a certain extent. And over the past year, my new role, if you will, is working primarily and exclusively with the sound team from the Berlin office, which is located in Berlin, Germany. So, and that's our headquarters. And although I live stateside and I'm based stateside, I work full time alongside the sound team crew, which is technically called the PAX team. So, and that umbrella basically includes quite an arsenal of folks, some really talented folks across the team, from development all the way to the folks that work specifically with our live packs and with our sound. And that's where I come in. And so my primary role is basically handling all our preset creation and content creation and the sound design for live. Yeah, and so it's great. I love it. It's a lot of fun and keeps me very busy. I'm afforded the opportunity to work with a great group of folks on the outside as well in regards to freelance contributors from
Hmm.
sound design. So some really quality, talented people out there that I brought into the fold working as freelancers as well. Just creating content that we're working with Live Nine and working with PAX and things like that, and overseeing that, and daily work, communicating and working alongside my peers
Right.
who are based on the Berlin team. So it's in conclusion on that, as far as what I'm doing right now, it's interesting because it might be confusing to some folks and some of my peers and friends that are like, wait, you still work for Ableton, but not in the U.S. And it's like I'm literally removed from all duties in the U.S., if you will. So I'm very close to this team that we have stateside,
Right.
Ableton Inc., which is based in Pasadena. I'm incredibly close to that team, and but I work, like I said, for the sound team, and it's great, and it's kind of full circle. It's where I started, and working with sound and creating and working with synthesizers and production and all in that on that studio recording sense. And it's a testament to the Ableton team that I sort of moved into this role, and I've embraced it, and I really enjoy it. So that's what I'm doing now. It's keeping me really busy. I'm still, I'm obviously composing and doing things on the outside and musically, multimedia and scoring and things like that. Working, a couple of sound library companies doing pieces for them and keeping myself busy there. But primarily, it's all Ableton every day. Like I said,
Right.
24/7, and a lot of that is just because I love it so much. It's just if I can make sound all day and work with sampling and work with technology, you know, it's
You're living life, right?
well, I got living the life, but it takes me into areas that just keep me completely ensconced in what I do. So it's whether it's after hours or whatever. It's like, hey, wait, maybe if I did a quick sampling session with this and brought this into here, created this sort of rack device this way, and it's interesting. I'm sure we'll get into that, but That's primarily what I'm doing now. So, there's aspects of my previous role, which was a lot of presentations, a lot of interaction on the university and K through 12 and educational level in regards to evangelizing Ableton Live, live and push.
Right.
And I miss that aspect a lot. But over time, working in this new role, I can see where it's just there aren't enough hours in the day. I still try to connect that way somewhat through my Instagram page and that tutorial sort of aspect on the social channels where I can. Those events, those types of things where I'm presenting or doing a panel, they're a little bit more spaced out. I think I'll see you at one at Berkeley next month. So
Yes,
those
indeed. Right.
so those kinds of things, those kinds of events, I really cherish those because that's where I get to interact and hang out with my peers and people I respect and get up there and just talk about the gear and talk about the technology and hopefully, kick off a light bulb, turn on something with these students and with these individuals that, are trying to get into this crazy world of technology and sequencing and modular and synthesizers. And so,
Right. Well, one of the things I want to do is I want to dive into a little bit of your work as a presenter slash clinician
mhm.
because when I used to watch you work, like at the NAMM show, as an example, first of all, you seem to be tireless, but secondly, you also, unlike a lot of people, you brought a lot of aspects of performance to it. You were engaging with the crowd. You kind of had like an arc to the way that you presented things. You were always really prepared, but at the same time, it always looked like you put yourself you had a little bit of risk so that there was that kind of real world performance aspect to what you were doing. Was I just making that up, or is that really how you approached it?
No, I think making it up is always an interesting aspect because I think sometimes folks look at that like, hey, bro, kind of winging it there, but it worked out. It's like, yeah, let me turn my mic off now. Let's talk about it. But
Right.
yeah, those were good times, and I kind of look at it because it was kind of back then in the day. I went, a decade or so ago, and through 2012, I think.
Right.
And I think you kind of nailed it on the head. I think there's a couple aspects that I bring sort of to my presentation stage, whether it's with product or presenting something more in a formal sense, like a product debut or something like that. But
Hmm.
when you're showing gear, first of all, I think number one is you got to really first you not only do you need to have an understanding of how it works under the hood, but you got to really dig the product.
Yeah.
I mean, you got it's with Ableton, like literally, whether it's connected to an APC 40 making its debut, or push, or showing it with Max for Live. I mean, that's fun for me. That's just fun stuff. The performance aspect, or the way you sort of frame that comes into play, I think, from just being a producer for so many years in the studio and a session player and being on call for a couple of decades. I started my session playing synth programming gig as an occupation as early as I want to say 92, maybe 1991, in West Coast, East Coast, LA to Atlanta, New York, working for producers and record labels and quite a variety of situations where I would be in studios on call with some formidable folks from, Babyface to Brendan O'Brien to all kinds of different artists. And, my job was to create on the fly, play on the fly, figure things out, on the fly. And I really enjoy that aspect. I enjoy sitting sort of in the bevy of individuals sort of looking at me saying, what are we going to do next? Oh,
Blow
a
me away
bridge,
now, man.
a bridge works there.
Right.
Well, I don't know about blowing them away, but it's sort of like the part may be complete, crap, but it's like, guys, we got to put a bridge here, but we'll cut it on the up of four, and then come back into the chorus. And it's like, yeah, let's do that. And it's like, so playing these different ideas and different parts, and always recording or having one hand on the record button, as they say,
Yeah.
was sort of the story of my life for a couple of decades leading up to my Ableton, entry into the Ableton presenting world. And I think it's an interesting thing because, as you walk around the NAMM show floor and you're seeing it's changed, I think. in the last 3, 4, 5 years. It's a little less of dog and pony and a little bit more of upfront, personal, smaller booths, more kind of like confined product presentations and things like that. You're always going to see the bigger sort of demos at UA and Digi or Avid, things like that. But I think from the performance kind of all-encompassing aspect that I would present, it was a combination of being able to multitask, keep the individuals that are watching engaged, but also pull individuals in. I used to enjoy doing that too. It's like I could sort of make some eye contact with somebody, and not really the pouty muffins guy that's in the back with his arms folded that wants nothing to do with this software or this product, but more the person that's kind of down front. It's like really sort of like they're interested, but they're also a little confused
Right.
because it's information overload. So it's like, hey man, what's your name? Okay, cool. So yeah, where do you find yourself when you're trying to work on some drum parts? What point of that process do you feel you need something like this? And then that question, or a question that's sort of framed like that, opens up a direction that sort of engages other folks. And then you can sort of take that and the whole time that I'm doing that, I'm also recording or playing, like you said.
Right.
And I think that's the part that sort of freaks people out a little bit. They're like, "What the jeez, man? What is going? What is he? Did he just create that little part?" And again, not to. It's not like to me. It's not really rocket science. It's just loving what you do, understanding the technology, understanding the scope of what needs to be presented from in this case, a company standpoint.
Right.
Keeping those boundaries. But at the end of the day, it's a trade show, man, and it's like it's not a TED talk. That's different. It's not up in front of Sweetwater
Right.
crew at 7 in the morning doing an
Right.
important presentation. That's a little different. You've got PowerPoints and you've got your iPad with your cue sheets on the floor, and you're doing, everything's all sort of framed out. And the trade shows were awesome. And I'm one of those rare birds that actually really enjoys the trade shows. It's like, oh, NAMM's coming, man.
Right.
I guess I'll see you guys in January, man.
Right.
And I'm like, hey man, who's going to be at NAMM? It's kind of
Yeah.
like it's different now. I'm a different capacity for me, and I'm not really presenting as much. But I have to say there was a turning point for doing those types of shows, and that was back with a really good group of folks that worked with M Audio back when M Audio was in its heyday.
Hmm.
And the funny thing about M Audio was there was a time when M Audio distributed Isotope, Ableton, and propeller heads
That's right. That's
all
right.
under one umbrella. And the crew was great. Like they had this whole team of folks. It was so much fun. And it wasn't just NAMM, it was Remix Hotel and AES and all these
Hmm.
different and CES. And we would roll out to these shows and just present all these awesome products. And that's where I actually kind of got my start doing public presentations per se. And
Hmm.
this individual named Adam Castillo and Mike Huckler and some of these guys, they kind of brought me into that fold. And I was the new guy. I was a producer in a studio that was suddenly brought up on stage to show these products. And to be quite honest, there were times when I was sort of flying by the seat of my pants, like, look, guys, I don't really know how this works, but they really want me to show it to you, so we're going to break it down in a studio sense. Like,
Right. Right.
let's make a hypothetical situation. That's another thing that I would do in these presentations. I would create scenarios, whether it's a bedroom producer or more in a studio situation type thing, a large format kind of studio, or tracking. Are you recording yourself as a singer songwriter? And those are the sort of aspects that I would bring to that game. I mean, I was working with vendors way back in the day. My first one was Akai, and I worked with Akai from '92 to the mid '90s, but never trade shows per se. And it was when the trade show thing started. I used to go to NAMM, but just as a
Hmm.
guest,
Right.
and I would see these guys like Phil Jackson.
Yeah.
Remember, really awesome
Oh my
guys like
God.
that. And I would see guys like Phil, and I was like, man, what a cool thing! What a cool gig!
Yeah.
Like he gets to get up there and just talk about awesome gear. And then next thing I know, like I'm kind of doing that. And
Right.
then suddenly I get hired by Ableton, and then I'm doing it for a specific company, and it just sort of ramped up from there. But those were good times, and I still enjoy it. Like next month for that Berkeley event, for example, that's kind of a reward for me being able to do something, having the privilege to be able to do that kind of stuff around what I do on a
Yeah.
regular basis, creating now creating sound, evangelizing Ableton Live and Push and showing things off, like favorite pieces of gear or modular gear or something on Instagram or whatever. It's like to be able to be in that environment, whether it's Berkeley or MTSU or Frost School at Miami University or whatever. It's like those are the environments that I really enjoy getting up and talking and presenting and moderating or whatever. That's good stuff.
Yeah,
So
well, one of the things I always did like is the way that you brought kind of a real practical. I never felt like you were following a script. Rather, I felt like you were sharing experiences. That's actually why I was looking forward to our discussion today because, even when you're doing presentations, there was a clear sense that you had a background doing this stuff. And when people would come to you and they would be like, yeah, I'm stuck in the middle of the production booth all day long. As much as I'd like to learn about some of this other tweaky stuff, I need to get shit done. How do I
yeah,
get shit done? And you had the experience and the comfort with the product, just be able to say, well, you could try this, you could try that. You always had that kind of advice right at hand, which was really unusual in comparison to a lot of the other presenters I saw who were so focused on nailing the script that they didn't really have an opportunity in their spiel to take 2 minutes out to talk about a specific scenario.
yeah, the dog and pony syndrome.
Right, right.
And yeah, I looked at you kind of bringing those points forward while you're talking about that. It makes me kind of reflect back on sort of key points and key moments. And I think a lot of it is being really fortunate to have experienced the kinds of scenarios and environments that I grew up in, per se, in the
Hmm.
studio world. And a lot of that was predominantly in the 90s. I mean, there's some really interesting things that kind of happened in the late 80s, kind of as I started discovering standalone sequencers with computers and sort of upping my game personally, but industry wise, really diving into uh, producing, like I was talking about earlier, the session player arranger aspect,
Hmm.
and making a living doing that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
all I did was I just lived in a studio and I'd get a note or a call, back in those days, it's
Yeah.
just I
Right.
get the message and it's like, hey, we need you in LA on Friday. Uh, you've got this, MCA is doing this new project with, this producer and this producer, and Teddy Riley needs you here for this. And so I would ship the gear, I'd ship my synthesizers and ship my gear, and I'd go and dive in and I would do that stuff. And it was the interesting thing this I keep coming back to it. It's multitasking,
Yeah.
and you can kind, you sort of like a innate rhythm characteristic. Like you kind of got that, or you kind of don't. And if you don't have it, it kind of comes across kind of fakey.
Right.
It's
Right.
like when you go to these shows or you see someone demoing products and it's that tandem thing, and like you and I, for example, it's like you're behind the computer and I'm on stage, and it's like, well, I don't know, Darwin, what would
Right.
happen if we open that track? And it's like, well, that's a good point, Houston. Let's open that up and take a look. And it's like,
Right.
well, great. So now we can see that the waveforms expanded into the.
Right.
It's so rehearsed and it's
Yeah.
so, and that works for some people. But I think there are two ways to kind of look at this. You have the enormous, crowded, noisy or show floor aspect environment, and then you have like the presentation, university level, TEDx slash thing, where it's a little bit more in your face, like kind of like workshops.
Right. Well, I always think of it as being like a kind of two different points. One of them is communicating. So sometimes you need to have a highly rehearsed thing so that you can communicate the information that has to get out in a specific amount of time. But I think there's another thing that has to be done or should be done, which is connecting with people.
Right.
And if you're so heavily rehearsed that you can't connect, that's where you end up with sort of like this feeling of, wow, I just watched a puppet.
There's a person I used to work with. You're acquainted with him too. His name's Dave Hill. Dave's
Yes.
an industry veteran. He's been around forever. He's a big primary reason that I became involved with Ableton from the get go. Dave was basically managed the U.S. team, and so my role as a clinician was to get out there and hit the trenches.
Hmm.
And when I say hit the trenches, I mean like out in it, like from the retail front to workshops to today I'm in Austin, Texas doing a workshop at this place. And then tonight I'm going to be up in Dallas doing, and it's like it could be a room of 20 people, it could be a room of 5 people.
Right.
But that's where you had to really connect, especially with a product like Live in the early days, where it had this whole DJ moniker attached to it, slash, I have no idea what the hell's going on. I look, it's like, hey, bro, I've got Live, and I really appreciate your presentation. I have it on my computer, but it doesn't make sense.
Right.
And to be able to spend 90 seconds or 5 minutes or whatever with that person and connecting and making eye contact and like really have an interest in like what they have to say, and being able to sort of disseminate between those individuals. And then, like I said, the grumpy guy,
Right.
or girl, like that are sort of like, it's just like, look, let's talk about it, or we need to move on. But it's those individuals that over the years that I would have these conversations with. I think that's what sort of builds that confidence on stage as a presenter, to be able to stop on a dime and then focus on a specific situation
Right.
that hopefully will open up into more conversation. And sometimes I talk about it that way too. I'm saying, well, let's wait a second. Let's talk to Jake about what he was saying about foot control as a guitar player, and be able to just punch in his vocals with a foot controller, because I think that's important. And then you sort of take that instead of just like, well, the easy route is always that, well, great question, Jake. Look, come up to me after the event,
Yeah.
and it's like, really, it's bullshit. It's like,
Right.
I mean, those are the important things. And getting back to like with Dave, it was like Dave used to always sort of instill that. He was like, it's okay, man, if you just take a second, take a breath, and just focus on, if you need to break it down into actual scenarios, especially with Ableton, because Live works in so many capacities, as we all know.
Right.
You don't even have to
Yeah.
go down that road, but performance, home recording, studio performance, all this kind of stuff. And so I sort of, again, really fortunate with the background that I have. A lot of situations where just, again, I can't stress it enough. I've just been really fortunate to have great mentors, really lifetime moments where it was like I'm watching these pros do this stuff, and I'm sitting next to someone making this record, Dave Pensada or whoever. These are friends of mine that I can look back on and go, man, I learned a lot from Dave
Yeah.
just on those vocal tracking sessions, being a producer or a session guy, watching them work. And then that led me into producing for a decade or so in Atlanta, bands, solo artists, all that kind of stuff, instrumental records, just producing and creating and working in all types of different studio scenarios, from big rooms to small rooms to designing rooms to building rigs. I think that all kind of comes into play on that. And it's fun to look back on those times.
Let's actually do that, because we've like laid down several breadcrumb trails to your history. And I've heard little sprinklings of it over the years, so I know maybe a little more. But let's actually jump in the Wayback Machine, and let's talk about, first of all, how you got started in music, but then especially how you got started in the professional world.
Well, there's not a lot of exciting information in the early days, because I'm not that kid who had the piano in the house. But I am that, in lessons and that kind of stuff. But I am the kid who had a musical household. And that is an incredibly strong, fond memory for me in my upbringing, is that we had a stereo in the living room. I had a stereo. My parents had a stereo. There was cassette players everywhere, and it's just music. There was always music. My mom had her thing on kind of the pop stuff, and my dad had his jazz stuff. And I think one of my earliest memories and my parents used to reflect on this as I got older through the years, is that gave me sort of the idea that this might be something I want to do, was sort of this abstract arc around music. And that was more of the broadcasting radio type or side of things. And I had this little Sony cassette deck, and I would, record things off the radio or whatever, favorite songs. And I'm like 8, 9, 10 years old. But I used to basically hawk my parents' cassette player from their room or from upstairs, and I would take that and I would actually overdub back and
Hmm.
forth. So I'd take one cassette and I'd put it in, and put the other cassette in the other machine. I'd record something off my stereo, off my records, but I would actually do a radio show. It's kind of like you. It's sort of like the Darwin thing, and I'd be like, "Hey, that's Elton John," and someone say my life tonight, and this is Houston on W da 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 whatever. But I would record that to the other machine, and I would put that back, and I would make these tapes, and I would multi-track back and forth, and then I would get the guitar, and I'd play little notes or whatever. But there was never really afforded a piano or any real instruments until I was around 12, and I got a drum kit because I really wanted to be a rock and roll drummer in a cool band.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was the age old story, It's like, man, I could play drums, I can be cool, I can meet girls, I can be in a band, and I played in these really shitty bands in high school, junior high. I didn't even play in high school because we were so crappy.
Right.
But I could keep a beat, but I don't think anyone else could keep a beat in the band. So we were just sort of like, I don't even think we had a name. It was just sort of like, but that kind of carried me through high school. But in my senior year, because now I'm reflecting back on this a little bit, I had this friend named Jim Shear, and Jim was a year in front of me, and he was a musician, and he was he's in theory and harmony class, and he would take all these classes, and he was this really cool guy, and so I was a junior and he was a senior, but I don't know why he did this, but throughout our friendship, he would give me prior issues of Keyboard Magazine and Mix Magazine. And he'd be like, man, you're going to love this. You should read this. Because I guess he'd figured out that I really enjoyed, because of my music collection and the things I collected and on record or vinyl and cassette and things like that. And so I used to read these magazines, and it was fascinating to read about Tamita and all these different, Larry Fast and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, man, these guys Keith Emerson. This is crazy. This is so cool. Look at these big giant synthesizers. And I'm like, oh my God, $7,000. I can't get one of those.
Right.
It's not like you're going to go upstairs to the breakfast table. And it's like, Mom, I was kind of thinking instead of that bike, I'd like this this Roland System 100. That it's like, this is not going to happen. But I attribute that to my buddy Jim. And Jim went on to MTSU and has a formidable recording career now and all kinds of other stuff. I look back on that, and it was at that moment that in the back of my mind, it was like, I'll do the thing, and I'll get into college, and I'll lay these foundations of what I think is the right thing to do, but I really want to get into this recording scene. And I did everything I could to get into any studio or any sort of like musician circle,
right?
Both summer after high school and in college. First 2 years of college, I would go to the music lab and fiddle around with these like Paya kits and things like that, and make these extraordinarily horrible noises and sounds, and fidget around with Roland JX8Ps and all this kind of stuff, and DX7s, but it started to grow from right there. And so fast forward a little bit, I finally was able to afford myself my first synth.
Which was what?
You would think, well, what was it, like a awesome Roland, or it was a Yamaha DX21.
Oh, cool. Okay.
The poor man's DX7.
Right.
And I took that thing, and I took a Q-Tech 4-track, and I sat in my apartment in college, and I would just make tapes. I would just multi-track all day with it. And then I got a drum machine, and I got a little tiny Yamaha drum machine, and I would figure out sync, and I figured this out, and I figured out sort of the basics of arranging and what a chorus was. Okay, 4 bars. Now I'm going to do this 8 bars, change the pattern. And these were the days when you would step in your patterns, and you would make these grooves, and it was pretty horrible. To me, it was amazing, but looking back on it, it was just sort of like a real simple scenario with a very simple set of tools. But I was incredibly passionate about it. And when I would share that passion with my parents, my mom and dad were incredibly supportive. They were like, look, sounds this, I'm sure there was probably a little bit of BS in there as I'd come home on Thanksgiving and play these horrible renditions of Gary Newman or something that I would sort of try to emulate on, and they were like, hey, this is okay. Well, we're proud of you. Keep it up. We're not going to pay for any of this.
Right.
But we'll pay for your books in school, but none of this music stuff. It's cool though. It's keep at it. I did stick with it. And
did you share it beyond like with your parents and like maybe your roommate? I mean, were you ever part of like the cassette culture or any of that kind of thing?
Yeah, somewhat. Because I work. The other thing is, I again going back to this whole music background of just musicology and like the recordings. I worked part-time and even full time in a record store as well,
Oh,
a couple
okay.
of record stores. So I was that
You were
guy.
that guy.
I was that kid. So I was like,
Mm-hmm.
college radio, Saturday from 2 to 4, making
Right.
mixtapes, doing this, trying to, having an understanding of, everything from who's producing records to where the culture lies regionally, like, oh, is this REM thing getting ready to happen? What's going on here? Hey, it's this, electronic stuff, pop stuff, but my music that I was creating, and it was starting to grow a little bit. I got, effect box and an SPX 90, and I would start to build my little studio like we all did back in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
man, where you kind of maybe stack and present a little bit more than you needed to. It's like a digital alarm clock on
Right.
top of the drum machine and the, you know what I mean? It's like the extra speaker on top of the other speaker that wasn't really on, and people come over and they're like, "Oh man, cool. What
Right.
are all those?" And it's like, "Well, yeah, I'm doing this," and you'd play your amazing creation of sequence, like pattern. But something was there because I stuck with it, man, and I kept at it. I kept at it, and that's when things started to open up a little bit in the right around 1991, I'd say, and I'd made the transition to Atlanta, Georgia, and it was an incredibly vibrant music scene at that time. There was a lot of things kind of exploding on the radar as far as cultural, the R&B thing and all this hip hop stuff, and I just started hanging in circles with these folks. I don't even really know how it started. It just next thing I know, I'm in the studio, different studio scenarios, but I happened to be alongside this other gentleman named Rick Shepard, sort of the go-to synth programmer drum machine guys. Like, hey, call them. They'll come in and help salvage this session because they have this thing that they can do that samples these vocals and like lays them out to where we can
And move them around
do
and stuff.
this and
Yeah.
do that. And yeah, call Houston. And so anyway, I started getting these calls, and I took advantage of it because at that time I was sort of figuring things out and was working and everything was okay in that regard, but I was still like burning the midnight oil, like in the studio at night. And I was like hustling. That's really the best way to put it. I was just doing the
Mm-hmm.
hustle, trying to wrap my head around ways to buy more gear and this and that. And so it was in those circles. It was in those impromptu sessions that would come up quickly, and getting through those sessions and the multitasking factor and being able to work on a dime. And sometimes I get paid, sometimes I wouldn't get paid. Sometimes I would use a certain session to vault into meeting someone else,
Right. Right.
and I would get that call. It's like the way I sort of put that is like leaving the door cracked a little bit, as I used to say.
Mm-hmm.
Is like you're in a studio where there's multiple studios, but you crack your door a little bit to let some of your sound sort of drift out in the hall.
Yeah.
So that A-list producer might be coming out of the A room down the hall and sort of hear your groove. And it
Right.
worked. Like guys would come in and they kind of knock on the, he's like, "Hey man, what's happening? What's that? What's that vocoder thing?" It's like, "Oh, I'm just working on some stuff." And next thing you know, I'm in a session with some ridiculous artist like Belle Biv DeVoe or something, laying
Yeah.
down a snare track or whatever. It's just really crazy stuff. But that's sort of that early sort of budding entry into going completely crazy in the 90s on synthesis and like really digging in and getting, being able to afford myself to have better gear and be able to discover the world of Moog for real and discover the world of
Right.
Roland like on a real tip, as opposed to
Yeah.
just perusing in a music store or
Right.
trying to bamboozle my way to someone to like, "Hey, I'll trade you 16 of these for your Roland D50."
Right.
I mean, those
Right.
were, I remember the day I walked into a music store and laid down close to $4,000 on an Akai MPC 60, the original.
Yeah.
Like, just I had waited, and I finally had the money, and I bought it because I knew that's what I wanted. This was like 1991, I think. And there weren't many people that had those. And that was a game changer for me. And then right after that, someone had handed me a demo license disc for Opcode Vision. And
Mm-hmm.
between the MPC 60 and Vision on my Mac SE, which at that time I was only really using as a flight simulator or something. Like,
Right. Right.
really, it was just sort of sat in the studio to prepare invoices. It wasn't really. I think I had Master Tracks Pro on there or something, but it was kind
Yeah.
of like I'd sort of dick with it, but I was really more into like hardware stuff. And man, an MPC, as most original MPC users will tell you, there was a workflow that just worked. It was really magical, and it was the process of how I always say is how the hands laid.
Yep.
It's where your hands fell on that unit And it's changed ergonomically over the years, obviously. But it's like it's what's funny is now that it's sort of like it used to be
Yeah.
with MPC Live. But that's another conversation. But that MPC was fantastic, and it taught me sequencing, and it taught me or techniques for sequencing. It really engaged me, and then I was able to take something like Opcode's Vision, which had that same sensibility as in regards to stepping sequences together in any
Yes.
way that you wanted to. So you could take sequence C twice, play sequence A once, tap, 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 go to sequence E twice, and back to C. And then play it back, and your magical thing would happen. And it was like, well, that freaking worked. And that would motivate me to just burn the candle. And I don't think I slept from 1989 to like 95 or 96 or something. I just, all I did was work. And I think that's a big, the 10,000 hour
Yeah. Yeah.
thing, like
It's
that's sort
real
of,
for you, huh?
I got that one. It's
Yeah.
like, and I
So,
preach that. It's like get your 10K,
yeah,
but if you really want to have a conversation and break it down, I'll break it down for you because there's
sure.
like yourself and me and other people that are kind of grew up in that era where we transitioned from standalone hardware to suddenly onboard sequencing things like Korg M1s and pioneering stuff to digital audio workstations. Like
Yeah.
we saw that. We were syncing stuff up back in the day. And
Well, the other thing though back in the day was that you sort of were stuck with having to spend a lot of time with the gear that you bought, right? I mean, unless you really did have limitless money, what you tended to do is you tended to buy one piece and you learned every idiosyncratic corner of it, you know? So it's interesting you talk about the NPCs because that was one of my things. Although, one of the things that's funny to me is that everybody who's like an NPC head, for them, the actual best NPC ever was the first one that they had,
oh,
right? So,
Darwin, I still have that MPC.
oh, do you really?
It's in
Oh,
a
that's
case. My
amazing.
friend Peter Jacobson has it.
Uh huh.
He and I shared some studio space back in the day. Yeah, it's still attainable.
Ah, that's awesome.
It's I'm telling you, it's like that was it was a stalwart piece. Like I
Yeah.
remember everything about it. That piece was so early and so ahead of its game that you actually had to take a floppy disk and put it in and then enter a whole bunch of numbers just so you could go into like local mode. Like it wouldn't
Right.
it was it didn't know what to do with itself
Right.
outside of its inert ability inside the box. And so
Yeah.
when you would want to connect a Korg M1 or a TR707 or whatever, you'd have to sort of do all these things. But when you got it, it still came down to just sequencing and stepping things together in this elegant way, as opposed to pushing 10, enter, push, enter, the Roland
Right.
MC500s, the
Right.
QX7, Yamahas, all that stuff that probably
Mind
half your
numbing.
listeners on
Yeah.
this podcast right now are probably Googling right now. They're like, Yamaha QX7. Oh, wow. What is that thing? Those were, yeah. I mean, we actually had equipment there. I remember a piece of gear that came out. It was this one of these pieces that was always there to save your ass in the studio. It was called a Russian Dragon.
Oh, the Russian
Do
dragon.
you
Yep.
remember the Russian
Oh,
Dragon?
you
Like
bet.
that shows you the era and the sheer amount of like chaos we had to deal with of like, okay, man, are we ready? Hold on a second. Is the okay, good. Did you strip a track? What? No, you got to strip two tracks, dude, because it's going to bleed. Okay, all
Yeah.
right, we're ready. Okay, go. And you would go and you would like, please don't get out of sync. Don't get out of sync. And it would stay in sync. You're like, yes, pass
Right.
number one. The label's
Yeah,
going to be
and
happy.
yeah,
It's like
it was like one out of four tracks would actually say sync through the whole run.
but the MPC was a magical piece. I knew that's what I wanted. I saved all my money. But what's interesting is it wasn't too far after that that my buddy Randy was walked in my studio. And at that time, I probably had 40, 50 synthesizers on the walls, and it was this massive setup. And I was just working, but I was MPC. And
Right.
Randy, this jazz player friend of mine, walked in, formidable jazz player, heavy cat, comes in and he's like, "Hey, I have this extra install of this sequencer for the Macs called Vision. You need to check this out." And I'm like, "Well, I got Master Tracks Pro." And he's like, "No. Totally different game." And that was it. And I think, according to Paul Benedictus at Opcode, I was the last user that I hung on to the very end, it's like
Mm-hmm.
2002 or something. That's how, and that's what you talk about MPC Legion, the
Yeah.
Opcode Vision Legion of users out
Yeah.
there, who some of them probably listening right now. That's a group. That's a group that I like to get together for a big breakfast one day.
That would be a hoot, wouldn't it?
and get Dave
because
Oppenheimer and all the creator, and we all just get it and we just reflect.
yeah.
We just like, because that was the game change. I mean, Motu performer, absolutely, stalwart piece. It's carried through in those days too. But man, something about Vision. Vision actually, Darwin, I'll be honest with you. Vision actually kept me focused on this career
Yeah.
and moved me. It as opposed to sort of maybe moving into some other areas of still related to this field, but it was like Vision kept me glued in the studio. It kept me in my chair, burning the candle, and just trying to figure out new ways to sort of branch into other areas. And
Well, one of the things I felt with Studio Vision was it was the thing that kept me making music instead of just devolving into sound design, right? Because with samplers and synth setups and all that kind of stuff, and you know, turbo vision and all this, or
it's Turbo
turbo
Synth.
synth, yeah,
Yeah,
turbo
Turbo Synth.
synth, right? But with turbo synth and those kind of things, I mean, I would have dove off into that little patio where the people that drool on their chest live as they design the next sound, right? But there was something about Vision, and especially this ability to integrate your MIDI work with your audio work.
Hmm.
And I too, had a hardware background, and so there was a sense where it felt really similar to that in a way that Performer didn't to me.
Yeah, well, I wasn't really afforded performer. I sometimes I reflect on this in conversation too. Randy may have walked in with performer that day.
Yeah,
You
it
know
would
what I
have been a
mean? It's
different
funny how
person,
we
right?
change. And that's sort of life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
person you meet is the one, or whatever, and that
sure,
sort of change. But it's like it was Vision for me, and it just
yeah,
I just I think too. I was very much into the OMS, the Open Music System capacity that they offered with that program. And basically, for anybody that's curious, what that allowed you to do was have this seamless integration of MIDI, addressing your MIDI from your desktop. So you could have 6 synthesizers on a wall, stacked up, zoned out, and then stacked or synced to something else, all within a single name. And so I could create these monstrous patches and all this stuff, like the MIDI memory mode layered with the Roland J800 with the Kawai G Mega module, made
hmm
this crazy ethereal space pad, but it was just named space pad.
right,
And you could click, but because of that, and I still have the old pat sheets for this, and this is what I was referring to. Paul Benedictus had told me that OMS rig was so large that I used to fax it. We used to fax it back and forth to Opcode, and I think they were in Cupertino or somewhere. And
yeah,
I would send it to those guys, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is the biggest. This is like 160 different things going on." I'm like, "Yeah, dude," but because there was just a few of us really doing that stuff on that
right,
level. There was Mike McKnight was kind of doing the LA thing. I was doing the
hmm
Atlanta thing. There was Donald Parks doing the thing in New York, and so we all were sort of these programmer guys
right,
that were just completely off our rocker on MIDI. Like it was just insane. But
yeah,
it was like, but opcode. And so when they went away in that big fiasco back, a decade and a half ago or whatever,
right.
they just retired. They just went away. A lot of people's like look back on that. It's like, well, they were bought out and it got screwed up. It just, we moved on. I think for me it
Yeah.
was Logic, and for a
Yeah,
little
it was
while.
it was Logic for
So
me for a while too, but I'll tell you, I was not nearly as productive until Ableton came along
yeah,
because
yeah, right.
there it just never clicked with me in a way. And then Ableton came along and I kind of had that kind of feeling too. But before we go too far down that road, despite the fact that you had this enormous rig, first of all, you're based out of Atlanta, which I assume you were primarily uh, doing hip hop gigs then, right? Or
Well,
and
interestingly
probably
enough,
like commercial and jingle type stuff
it's
too,
kind
right?
of, well, it's interesting. Atlanta, and still is to this day, Atlanta was also a very formidable multimedia centric town because we had CNN
Oh,
and Turner.
right, of
And
course.
so there were guys, I can name them too. I mean, on one hand, there were guys who were totally into that craft, and they were nailing the multimedia stuff internally for like CNN and
hmm
Turner, and the budding era of Cartoon Network and all that kind of stuff. But musically, the landscape was definitely hip hop. It was that whole kind of the birth of the New Jack Swing era,
Right.
and Dallas Austin, Jermaine Dupri, and all that kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
and TLC. And I tell you what the game changer was for the Atlanta scene, and also for me, was when L.A. Reid and Babyface and LaFace Music moved to when they relocated to Atlanta, and they
Mm-hmm.
brought MCA Records with them. And so under MCA and Universal, that opened up a lot of work for folks like me. But I had also established a really good relationship with Babyface and Daryl Simmons through an individual named Donald Parks, who was their programmer,
Okay.
who was another mentor of mine. Different capacity, different approach to doing sound design and doing MIDI work and things like that. But that's got me a ton of opportunities to be in studio scenarios where, and sometimes where I wasn't even really working, I was just sort of there as a backup or to help or something. Where it was like, hey, can you bring your MKS80? We want to stack that with this thing. And it's like, yeah, I'll just bring it down. I'll hang out. And I'd just hang out, but I'd watch and I'd listen and I'd watch guys like Dave Pensato or John Gass or Dave Way or these guys like sitting next to them in a console and just kind of going, huh. So you actually create an AUX and you print that, but you actually leave one channel free for the, okay. And I would sort of make these mental notes on like,
Mm-hmm.
I see what you're doing there. And I would take that and I would microphone technique, microphones, like different ways those were used, miking a piano, miking a vocal, miking a guitar. And I would take those attributes and I would go back to my studio. And I have a big passion for guitar. That's one of my favorite things in the world to record and to work with and interact with. And I would use miking techniques on vocals and guitars the same way that I would see these individuals using it in these major sessions. And so my sessions, I mean, they weren't small or tiny or irregardless, but they certainly weren't the capacity of $2,000 a day productions, you
Right.
know. But I would take that and I was like, okay, cool. I need to do my vocal booth like this, or I need to up my game with a synchronizer this
Right.
way,
Right.
or maybe I don't need this. And it was interesting. The Atlanta landscape, again, really fortunate because that was a really heavy time in Atlanta, 92 to around 98, I want to say in there.
Place was
It's like,
blowing up.
it
Yeah.
was crazy. And I was right smack in the middle of it. And to this day, there's a circle of us, a good dozen or so, maybe a few more. We're all still doing the thing. And
Mm-hmm.
we are in touch. We're in touch through NARIS. We're in touch through different guilds and organizations. We're in touch. And we're like, hey, man, how's the studio? Or hey, what are you doing? And it's like, this person's still working with Elton John, there's still a person still engineering this, and
Oh, that's cool.
it's a good family. So to answer your question, it was I found myself in the hip hop sort. What really was more R&B. Hip hop wasn't even the thing. I was in the R&B scene as a session player and as a
Mm-hmm.
programmer, and I made a living doing that. But I was also a record producer in my own environment, working with singer songwriters, doing a lot of pop stuff, and I was recording instrumental music with a lot of guitarists and violinists and doing instrumental records and then putting my flavor underneath and creating these sort of modern classical instrumental projects out of my studio. And I was afforded a great opportunity because I developed a decade plus relationship with a guy named Paul Diaz who owned a studio named Tree Sound. And we sort of built this studio up, but I had part of that facility as my own. So I had two SSL rooms to my left and right, and I'm upstairs in my room,
Oh,
doing my
wow.
thing. So I was, and it was a really, again, really fortunate thing, and I was able to maintain that relationship and foster that, and be able to step out of my room, take the masters down, do a quick tracking session in the A room, but then walk back upstairs to my
Right.
studio. And I had that studio at about '04. It was right around the time I started with Live, and
Okay.
now a friend of mine runs that. But so it was a very diverse scene in Atlanta, and it was broadcast, multimedia, hip hop, singer songwriters. Because you got to look at it's definitely in the earth in
Right.
Georgia. The Sean Mullins and the REMs
Yeah.
and all this kind of. So it's more than just that huge budding R&B scene, but I think that mixture, and even today, so many formidable artists and producers are still in Atlanta or coming out of Atlanta that are paving the way, still today. It's an interesting thing. So
It is. At one point you're running 40, 50, 60 cents, but that was also the time frame when all of a sudden virtual instruments and virtualization in general gets to be the thing, right?
yeah.
How hard was it for you, first of all, to make the transition from hardware guy to software guy? And secondly, did you bail on all the hardware, or did you keep it, or did you put it in a storage container somewhere?
That's a
How
yeah,
did you deal with that transition?
that's a great way to put it. And this sort of I enjoy talking about this aspect because there's different ways to look at it from fanatical collector, I don't know
Hmm.
what I'm doing aspect to true diehard synth purveyor back in the day, still doing it guy. I know that's
Right.
a lot of information, but I always earmark it as 2000. And I also earmark that era of the software synth moniker as Apple Loops era.
Ah,
So it's like one
interesting.
day we're all in the studio, we're doing our thing, and then suddenly there's this Apple Loop shit, and it's like, what is it? What's going on? You can just drag this in, and it just plays these awesome grooves, and it's like, yeah, cool. Let me drag this Apple Loop into track 4 against this pop tune, and oh, okay. And then suddenly it's like, hey, there's this ESX, ES1, or hey, there's this Rob Papin albino
Right.
thing. Check, or I think one of the early ones I remember was the Novation base station or something like that. There was some kind of Novation plugin, and it was cracked, and everybody had it, the jewel
Yeah.
case with the Sharpie serial code, and it was kind of like, okay, I'll put this in. But I was an adopter to it, but it was very slow because I basically at the end of the day I was making a living and I had to work, and it was like I
Right.
didn't really have time to sort of go, oh, cool, let's kick our feet up and dick around with this software synth. It's cool, and I'm playing it, and it's that's pretty nice. And I remember I would kind of toy with it, sort of. I envisioned probably the same way people sort of toy with Ableton when they first get it.
Hmm.
Put a couple clips in clip view, session
Right.
view, launch a clip. Okay, that sounds cool. Now what do I do with it? And so but the jump was pretty quick because I remember looking back on Albino, for example,
Hmm.
as an example. And the ES1. I don't even think it was called the ES1 back then because it was still eMagic or something. But I remember tooling around with this from the sound design perspective and being such a huge fanatic of sound and synthesis. I actually got into it. It sounded different, and
Yeah.
and that connection between what's happening from the wrist down into the computer was definitely a disconnect as
Hmm.
opposed to my hands on an OBX,
Right.
or memory mode, turning knobs and making obvious changes to my ears while I'm turning a knob. But it kind of didn't really matter at the end of the day because it sounded pretty good. I was sort of entertaining myself, and then I found myself making presets, saving
Hmm.
them,
Hmm.
and then going, Dear Rob Papin, hey man, I got these presets. Do you want them? Say, yeah, sure. Or, hey, Greg Teague at eMagic, do you want these presets on this ES1? I'm just dicking around with it. You're welcome to have them. And I would sort of play with it, but nothing ever really got into my workflow. It was
Right.
this sort of bastardized external thing.
Oh, that's
Like literally,
interesting.
I hadn't really thought about that until you brought that question up. It's like I really didn't start incorporating. I'll frame it for you. The time frame around 2003, there was this plugin that came out. It was a beast of a plugin. It was called the Time Warp 2600,
Yep.
and it was this ARP 2600 emulation by this guy named Jim
Uh-huh.
Hines.
Yeah, the
Just
way out where one, right?
yeah, way out where amazing dev guy, just
Hmm.
coder, and he made this thing, and it was great. And he emailed me or contacted me, and he was like, "Hey, I'm looking for guys to do some presets because it's going to debut at NAMM, blah blah blah, whatever." And I was like, "Sure, man, I'll do those for you. That sounds great." And I think back then he actually had to mail me the box
Hmm.
because we didn't, you couldn't download anything,
Not something that big, right?
not or whatever. So anyway, I remember that a bunch of the raw Papin stuff, a company called Sample Logic, and a few others. I just started diving in, exploring. It was more of an exploratory thing, but I really enjoyed it. But they still, I could not get them involved in my production process because at that point it was like Pro Tools mixed with Logic, mixed with hardware, and I was working day to day. I was record label budgets, all this kind of stuff, recording, and it was sort of like, I'll get to that later. But then it just like overnight, suddenly I found myself like, why wouldn't I put this tune track Easy Drummer drum kit to replace these certain drum stems? Like it just made sense. And
It's interesting for me to hear that it took so long for you to integrate into your thing because and maybe it's because you were comfortable or the work environment that you'd gotten used to was different than mine. One of the reasons that I ended up jumping in quick was because the frustration of working on a track, and then all of a sudden you get the call, and oh, I got to work on this other track. So you reset everything, and then you're going back to do the first track, and you're like, okay, I got to get my 20 cents back to what was the environment on that thing. Oh shit, that's never going to happen,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Well, I think that is attainable to the type of hardware that you have. I mean, for me, as opposed to a piece of hardware that's total analog knob control versus an MKS 70 with preset
Right,
configuration.
right.
So I could still get that call and say, okay, cool, bank B, patch 42, that was the bass, the slippery bass that was,
Right.
okay, cool. As opposed to a Memory Moog, a Prophet 5, a Pro 1, a modular, whatever.
Yeah.
Sure, I totally get that. Like, it's like, oh man, patch sheets everywhere. It's like, you
And
know,
still, it never was. You would always end up, because the problem with that was that in your head, you would always think it sounded a whole lot better than it probably did. So if you didn't lay down the track onto tape or onto a hard drive, you
absolutely.
inevitably would come
Yeah,
back to it, and you'd follow the
yeah.
patch sheet, and you'd think that it's humping along, but you're like, yeah, but it was so much cooler. It had this like breathing thing before, and I can't get that back, and oh, this
Sure.
sucks. And
To look back on, there was a time to look back at a time when we actually ran a freewheel DAT tape
uh,
to capture
just in
all the shit
case,
we were doing in the studio because of
right?
that reason. It's like,
Just in case, right?
hey, what was 2:30 today, man? What? Remember that thing? It's like, yeah, I'll go back on the. I swear to God, we would run this, and I still have these cases of DAT tapes and zip drives and all these things, and the gear locker just. I look at them and it says session 1, 6 hour, blah blah blah, and it's like I got to listen to this, man.
Yeah,
And it's
right.
just these spotty, random with breaks in between of like sounds. And I probably should. I should probably incorporate that into my role now. It's like make some sample library of stuff. But today the modern version of that is when how many times you take out your iPhone and take a picture of your modular rig.
Yeah, right.
You just
Yep,
do it, and
yep.
you're not going to go look at that shit. When you snap that iPhone
Right.
of your three of that one space rack of the patch cable, you're not going to go
Never
back
gonna
and
go
look.
back.
It's
No. Well, and again, and even if you do, you're gonna have built up some kind of mythology that means that even if you exactly replicate it, you're still gonna believe that it's not the same.
it's not, and that's a great point. What you said earlier, it's never quite the same. Maybe on a mini Moog D or something, but when it comes to modular or something more expansive,
Yeah.
like where you take those patch sheets. We all have our method. It's kind of funny actually. Somebody should put out a small little book on it of like patch sheets from Darwin, patch sheets from da da da, Tomita patch sheets, like all the
Right.
different ways that so you look at it's just kind of hysterical.
Yeah, it
Like
is.
the person who's totally OCD on their patch sheets, as opposed to the person like me who's just flied by the seat of his pants, like, oh yeah, mark, 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 and then play it back 3 days later, and you're like, no,
Right.
that is not the way that OB8 should be sounding by
Yeah.
any means. I think dynamics come into play there
Oh yeah.
because there's a lot of times where you got your chain, your signal chain, and you're running some of this analog centric gear, and you've got to switch, you've got to do something else. You're closing a session out. You come back to it, whether it's a personal session or work for hire, and it doesn't sound the same. It's like you got to look back. It's like, well, what was I running that through?
Yeah, right. What was my gain setting on the
Right,
channel when I
exactly.
split off into a pair of
Was I
compressors?
multing
What
that? Did
was
I
I doing
reamp
that?
it?
Yeah.
Was it
Right.
where was my mic pre? Shit, I can't tell you how many
Yeah.
times. I mean, do you really think how many people today are using wax pencils in their studio? It's just not happening.
Right.
It's not happening. It's like it's all about saving those notes, which is great in the computer. And back to that original question you had on my transition. Eventually, I just went full force, and it was just like this is just a mixture. And it wasn't until Ableton Live introduced the external instrument device, which
Hmm.
allows you to basically merge an audio and MIDI track into one
Right.
with low latency, granted, depending on your interface. I was able to do that. So now I can, and I have been for a decade plus, like able to mix and match dozens of pieces of analog synths and drum machines and modular gear, for example, in live, completely integrated, layered with not just virtual instruments, but editors. Like I treat device chains in live within a master device. Sometimes I have the editor in there as well, with a lot of the Moog stuff, for example. So I can tweak a knob, it tweaks the parameter, in the software version or the software editor, and then that's all saved as an instrument rack. To me, that's just, it's fascinating and it's fun and it's proactive. And if it could get me from point A to point B quicker, I'm all about it.
Right.
But in the end, it comes down to the sound. I mean, I have to have that passion for making that sound the way I want it. And if it's not right, I'm going to go back and do it again. And now, especially making sound full time, aside from doing it on the outside of that realm too, it's like the software instrument aspect of being able to save on the fly, save a different version even, and then come back later and mix and match and stack and change is a fantastic thing for me. And it's only getting better. The sound of some of the Yuhi products today and the sound of some of the raw pape and stuff like the Predator 2 and that new Pro 1 thing from Yuhi, though, you listen to that stuff, a Keyscape, Omnisphere, it's like, you listen to that stuff in a good room, and people say system, I sort of attribute it to the room. You listen to that stuff on a good playback system, and you're putting some force into playing those software instruments the right way. I mean, it's to the point now to where it's unbelievable sounding.
Yeah.
Like if you can't make music now, you don't really have a lot of excuses now. It's sort of back in the day, you could be like, yeah, this didn't sound right. I'm going to go back to my chord Diosis 1, dude. It's like, well, you go ahead and do that. But now it's kind of like good stuff. Like
The question I have for you is, how much do you think that actually affects the level of complexity that people are willing to embrace anymore? Because at this point, if something's hard, I mean, go back to your DX27. When you first got that thing, there was a bunch of stuff that was just butt hard about it. But you didn't have a choice. You didn't have a choice. It was the only damn synth you had, so you had to figure out all the hard stuff. Now it strikes me that, and I hate to sound like "get off my lawn," right? But I mean, it does seem like right now, if you buy a thing and it's like, oh, this interface is a little hard, screw it. I'm gonna get something else,
I,
or I'm gonna download something else.
I think is a big attribute to decisions that are made today. Number one, it's influence from formidable artists or names that someone can go on a social channel or they can go online or whatever, or in passing, and they're like, oh, well, so and so's using that. I'm going to go check it out. Dear Sweetwater, dear Guitar Center, dear whatever.
Right.
But the thing that I think that the game changer was 6-7 years ago is the proliferance of YouTube tutorials. And it goes back to my comment about if you can't make music today with technology, I mean, it's there. I can't tell you how many times, it's not a lot, but several times a week, I'll hit a note back to someone who has a question about something. And I'm like, hey, I'm sending you this Ask Audio feature they did on External Instrument. I think it's one of my favorite ones. Here you go, Mark. And then they hit me back and they're like, dude, that was it. That's all I needed to know. And it's like, all it is a video, man. It's great. So it's like if you can literally type it in, you just type in velocity Moog. And there it is. It's like, oh, I see. Now I can do my Mother 32 this way because there's 17 versions from 17 different guys. Some of them shitty, some of them silly, some of them the guy gets on, you can't even understand what they're saying, but it's like, you're going to figure it out. And I think the advanced sort of breadth of like, oh, this is too much for me to absorb. I think a lot of folks are realizing now, this maybe was different a couple of years ago, even as soon as a couple of years ago. In 2017, I think a lot of folks, demographically too, even down early age, young to veterans, they you can go online. You can even, it's surprising the amount of people that sign up for courses too.
Yeah.
Because it's all out there. Like stuff I don't even know about. I'm like, oh, really? They have a course now on isotope?
Right.
No shit. And it's like, yeah, man, I did the 14-part series on ozone. And I'm not really poking fun of that. I'm just amazed that you can actually go for $20 or whatever. You can go to this site and kind of learn about synthesis, the differences between a TVF and a DCO or whatever. It's like from whomever. I'm not going to say names. I mean, there's dozens of them. A lot of these people I know. A lot of people have actually asked me to do stuff for them, and it's like, it's great. I really enjoy passing that information. Like sometimes I'll see that email at the corner of my eye of like, oh, here comes a question or whatever. And that's cool, but or a text or something. And you can always tell the way that they're started what it's going to be.
Yeah.
Like it's like if you can see where it says, hey, man, quick question for you. And you're like, oh, shit. Here it comes. But it's like being able to send just a link
Yeah.
from whoever. It's awesome. And so I didn't have that back in
Yeah.
2003, 2004. When I started with live, I'm a little bit of a late bloomer to live. I have a heavy respect for cats that really jumped on live at the beginning. I remember meeting Gerhardt at their first trade show,
Hmm.
but I remember him handing me a demo and me just sort of like, okay, I don't really know what's happening with this.
Well,
Once I
it
got it,
seemed improbable because at that time we had Cubase, we had Logic, we had Studio, we had all these
yeah,
things. Last thing anyone needed was another DAW. So even though I knew them from both their work as Monolake and as well as
sure,
being Max users, it was sort of like, yeah, rock on, guys, good luck with that. And
right.
then I got a chance to try it out, and it was like, oh shit, this is different,
Yeah, it
right?
took me like I want to say 4 times of really going at it. There was the early sort of well, there was a version I got from Gerhardt, which I remember specifically the moment
Uh
that
huh.
happened. I think it was that NAMM show 99, 2000 or something, maybe AES or something. But then it started floating across my desk in the studio.
Yeah.
So cracked version, whatever, version two, this, that, green, yellow, blue. And
Right.
it got up to about version four. And I remember I would do it sort of like when you asked about how long it took me to transition to software sense over hardware.
Hmm.
I would do it sort of after hours.
Right.
I want to say it was even on a separate computer. And
Yeah.
I'd put these stems in or whatever. And I remember specifically I was working on a Matchbox 20 record and I had all these stems of Rob Thomas and all these outtakes and stuff, just sort of in Pro Tools. And it was really late one night, and I was like, you know what, let me just call up live. And I called it live four, and I drug some stems in, and then I just put a beat under it in another clip slot. The light bulb started to go off, but then it wasn't just the session launching and sort of the warping thing,
Right.
which even at live four was a little, it wasn't primitive, but it was interesting. It was an interesting sort of process to
To
absorb.
behold. Yeah.
Yeah, but I remember I changed the tempo, but then it was the global record.
Mm.
And I spoke about this over the many years once I started working with live about that light bulb moment. And it was when I realized that I could take multiple clips of different loop areas of that original clip across an entire outlay of clips and be able to arrange them like I wanted in scenes, but record all that on the fly.
Right.
And then hit that tab key. And once I saw that linear view of what I just did as sort of, I remember giving the demo to Matt, the producer for Matchbox, and to Rob and the guys, and I'm like, "Hey man, check this out." And they were like, "Dude, that's awesome. Let's release a remix."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Yeah, it's this thing, it's Ableton stuff, man. It's pretty cool." But at that point, it was still sort of like burning the candle for me. It was kind of like, okay, I'll go spend some time with live. But
Right.
that's when I sort of dug in. And then right around version 5 or so, I'm going to say 2005 or so, that's when basically the way I refer to it is that's when my Logic key came out.
Mm-hmm.
It just came out, sat on the desk, and I was literally all in. It was just
Yeah.
Ableton, Pro Tools, and eventually the HD system just started going dark.
Right.
The audio improved, the MIDI improved. I started working for the company. That didn't hurt. I started associating more with live users and this whole army of like hardcore longtime users. And then it rolled over into my sound design. And I started doing all my sound design work in live with the macros and with MIDI, mapping control and all this kind of stuff. And that was it. So,
Well, I'm afraid that we have more than burned up the time that I wanted to take from you, and we haven't even really gotten to talk about like half the stuff that I want to talk about. So we're gonna plan on doing this again relatively soon because talking about things like sound design, especially now that you're focused on pack development, talking a little bit more about the process of being a clinician, but also how that moved into education and all that stuff. I really want to get into that, but
I'd love
we
to.
we
That'd be
don't
great.
have the time to. Well, so let's plan on doing that again soon. All right.
You got it, man.
Um, before I let you go, one of the things I do want to do is ask you one thing, which is you have had the opportunity to touch, hold, and love practically everything out there, right? What to you still remains like the holy grail, whether it's hardware, software, it's a sample set or an effects plugin or maybe a rack mount effects tool or what? What is the thing that still to you represents like kind of the epitome of music making tools?
I would say it's definitely hardware, and I would say it's twofold. But I would say a combination of hardware being my diehard Moog pieces,
Hmm.
mini Moog, and Roland J800, that type of air, that 90s sort of like,
Yeah.
but I got to be careful because this is that little rabbit hole you can go down. When you ask this question, then it turns into like a 90-second sort of testament to
All
7,000
right.
pieces of gear.
Yeah.
But I sort of look at like the desert island question. If you had to be on a desert island, sure, I would want Omnisphere, and sure, I would want my push.
Hmm.
But on a desert island, technology wise, playing wise, and being satisfied, it's a cross between a Moog, just for that sheer brute sound of just getting what I want,
Hmm.
albeit monophonic. The Roland era of the JD coming out of the MKS era,
Right.
and a well tuned, well honed Fender Rhodes. That, I mean, really, at the end of the
Yeah.
day, I'm the guy that's going to stay in the room while everyone else goes out for a beer if I'm sitting in a Rhodes or a Whirly that's tweaked. It's like
Right.
that's kind of all I want, man. But that's getting a little personal. But I think
No.
technology wise, I can't get enough of my push. I think that's probably evident on my Instagram page, but
Right.
I absolutely love where we are with current technology, but I also love the fact that we can integrate the older, more heritage pieces into that workflow. And so I think, if I had to walk away with a couple of pieces, it would be a combination of some old Roland hardware and Moog, because I can make some music with it.
Yeah. Right.
I
Sure
could
enough.
make some music. I could run a Zoom recorder and I could literally do something that I feel good about
Right.
to present and to throw up on Bandcamp or whatever and say, man, this was fun. This was,
Yeah. And I was
you
stuck on a
know,
desert island, but I had a hell of a time.
I
Right.
had power. It's like I tell folks these days, like, look, sound design, I can do sound design on a mountaintop in Utah, man. As long as I got Wi-Fi to send
Yeah.
the stuff away, once I'm done, I'm good. So
Yeah.
I don't need a whole lot. Yeah, I'm very passionate about the hardware synth stuff and even the OB6 and some of this other stuff that just blows me away, and Tone Stars and Studio Electronics. They're, like I said, that's a rabbit hole
Hmm.
question in a way. It's kind of like, but I hope I answered it clearly
Yeah.
enough.
And then the flip side, if someone came up to you, as they probably do all the time, but if my 16-year-old son comes stumbling up to you and it's like, I'm really getting into this thing, and but I need your advice. How do I take the next step? How do I get to where I could be a professional in this world? What is the advice that maybe it wouldn't have been appropriate for you at the time when you were coming up, but what would you give advice to people coming up now?
I would say immerse yourself with proper gear that's in your wheelhouse. Don't step outside those boundaries. If you really want to make electronic music or you want to make synth-based music, get yourself a microbrute. Get something that can give you a great sound, get the job done. If you want to be a producer, get yourself in a scenario where you can interact with individuals and record them, whether it's in a rehearsal space or a shared office park venture where you can set up your gear and you can record bands or vocalists and start getting in that world, because you can stay in your bedroom forever and you can stay in your headphones forever. But if you really want to get diverse and you really want to get into the role of producing and arranging and having an understanding of how this business works in regards to songwriting, you got to get yourself out in it, unless you've been put in that environment in another situation. So as a 16-year-old, as a college kid or high school kid or even K through 12, like younger, that's like, I really want to get into this. Get yourself a controller, simple, pad controller, get a program like Live, and just watch the living shit out of every YouTube tutorial that you can. And if you can, and the other thing is, if you can sit side by side with someone that's already advancing in that particular wheelhouse, again, like producing EDM music, scoring movies, producing bands, writing your own songs, whatever that is, try to connect with that person on a weekly basis. If you can, laptop to laptop, and watch what they're doing. That speaks volumes. And I recommend that to everyone that's starting out, especially with sequencing and recording. And it's if you can get with a mentor, someone that you respect, someone that's going to allow you to sort of hang with them for a bit, and just sort of take mental notes, and then immediately go back to your environment and your studio, and don't stop until you get it right. It's dedication. It's no different than any other task that you're trying to achieve. It's just we're in this music business, so it's this loose kind of out there thing. It's like, oh man, making music. That's the hopefully encouraging advice that I could give someone, especially when they're getting into it. There's a difference between the 45-year-old 9-to-5 lawyer guy who can afford to go buy a ton of gear, and now he suddenly wants to get into dinking around with beats and putting some stuff on SoundCloud, as opposed to that really hungry 16-year-old who's got a little bit of some funds, but he wants to make sure he's making the right choice of what to get started with and not be overwhelmed. It's like, no, you don't need to go buy a whole rack of UAD stuff and all this other really crazy stuff. Start with the basics. Get a microboot, get a pad controller, get live intro, whatever. If you're going to record bands, get yourself a DAW, get yourself a nice PreSonus mic pre, the basics. But YouTube, I'm telling you, it's like, it's unbelievable. We all do it. Like, you get on there and you surf around on YouTube, and you get, it really gives you an overarching view of like how much knowledge is out there to learn. You can just dial it in. It's like proper gain stage on recording vocals with a Rode mic. And literally there will be a title of a YouTube with that exact verbiage. Like, it's right there. It's like, oh, it's like, hey, my name's Nathan, and today I'm going to tell you how to record. And today I'm going to tell you how to set the Antares to get that flippy weird effect that's on the T-Pain stuff. And you're like, oh, well, there you go. Cool. That's all I need. And sometimes you don't even have to go more than 30 seconds in. It's sort of like learning how to work your GoPro.
Right.
How to do this on the setting of the GoPro. Oh, there it is, 10 seconds in. That's all I needed.
Right. I'm done.
I'm done. I mean, there's a whole nother demographic coming up, and times, 3 or 4 back, that are hungry and they're ready to work and they want to learn, and it's exciting. And it's hopefully, folks like us can encourage a lot of these individuals to make the right steps. It's something I enjoy, like, hopefully that they can walk away and be like, huh, okay, these are the tools that I need, as opposed to overwhelming myself. It's kind of like the modular rabbit hole, and those websites, trademodulargear.com, hey, modular community, I'm upping my game and I'm getting rid of these 17 pieces, willing to trade. It's like, dude, you just come out and be honest.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you filled your credit card. You have no idea what you're doing.
You're a baseball card collector.
It's good for us because we can buy it cheap, but just, maybe go buy a microbrute and you're good.
All right, Huston, well, thank you so much again for your time. I really had a blast talking and getting a lot more details about your history. Amazing stuff. Thank you so much.
Me too, man. I enjoyed it. I'll see you. I'll see you next month, actually.
Sounds great. I'll see you then. All right, man.
Okay.
Catch you later. Bye. Hey, many thanks to Huston for the great chat. The guy's got such history. I'm really looking forward to kind of having a second pass with him. We can talk in a little more detail about some of his work and his perspectives on how to do presentations and how to do sound design too. So hopefully we'll get on that sooner not later. I want to thank everybody for continuing to listen, and I will be catching you next week. See you later. Bye.